By the end of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had permanently changed the life of America's workers. Concentrated mostly in the cities, they were forced to endure poor wages, intolerable working conditions, and substandard housing. The crowded tenements of the industrial towns violated all rules for plumbing, drainage, ventilation, and public health. Workers found that their employers cared little about their safety and often required them to work under hazardous conditions. Children were forced to spend long hours in the factories so that their families could earn enough to survive. These conditions led to many demands for change. Bitter labor unrest erupted as the conflict between labor and management intensified. In those times, it seemed unlikely that this struggle could be resolved. There were not many businessmen who could sympathize with the plight of their employees, but in 1886, the owner of a wholesale plumbing business took a daring step. He offered to share the profits of his company with his workers. This enterprising individual, a Norwegian immigrant named Nels Nelson, had a radical idea: that labor unrest could be eliminated by giving workers a stake in the company, pleasant working conditions, and decent housing. In 1890, he put his theories to the test by creating a model industrial village where his employees could live and work in an atmosphere of harmony and cooperation. The community, named after the French pioneer of profit-sharing, Edmond Leclaire, provided workers with steady employment, educational opportunities, and recreational facilities. Because residents could purchase their own homes at a reasonable cost, the village had a higher percentage of homeowners than any other town in America. Nelson's experiment turned out to be one of the most successful attempts at cooperative living. The company which he founded grew into one of the largest of its kind in the country, and the nearby village of Leclaire is still a prosperous and a pleasant place to live. The success of these two endeavors is a tribute to the vision of its founder, N.O. Nelson. Nels O. Nelson was born in Lillesand, Norway, on September 11, 1844. His family came to the U.S. in 1846 and first settled in St. Joseph, Missouri. After serving in the Union Army during the Civil War, he moved to St. Louis in 1872. The young Norwegian showed a talent for business, and within a few years he owned his own plumbing supply company. In 1886, a bitter railroad strike affected many industries, including Nelson's. Instead of blaming the workers, he began studying the reasons for the conflict and began to develop his own ideas of how to improve labor relations. He came to believe that cooperation was the key to minimizing employee unrest. That year, he became one of the first employers to introduce profit sharing to his employees.
The working men in the United States were attempting to organize. And up until probably the Civil War, if people attempted to form a union, this would be viewed as a conspiracy. There were still problems with child labor and women working in factories. He saw this sort of thing, and he had a social conscience, but he also was a very practical man. He viewed that strikes were really neither to the benefit of the strikers nor to the benefit of the capitalist, that everybody lost on this, and that there must be some better way of approaching the resolution of the conflict between labor and capital.
Nelson's philosophy became based on the belief that workers needed only a good home and a decent paying job to achieve a happy life. He studied the writings of many of the social thinkers of his day and explored a variety of new economic concepts. Gradually, he became determined to create a working environment that would put his newly developed theories to a test. By the 1880s, St. Louis had become a crowded, dirty, unhealthy place to live and work. Since his business was thriving and needed to expand, Nelson began to consider moving his company out of the city. After searching the area, he found a suitable location just south of the town of Edwardsville in Illinois. Recognizing the economic potential of this new industry, local businessmen and citizens donated to a fund which eventually raised over $20,000. The money was used to purchase 125 acres of land for the project. The site was generally level and was close to railroad lines, coal mines, and fresh water. On May 12, 1890, ground was broken for the first buildings, and the new model community was born.
It was in probably the mid-1880s that he decided that he would like to establish a village and plants outside of the city of St. Louis. Nelson believed that the good life was predicated on a series of principles. One, a sound housing, a good house, a job, work, beauty, recreation, and education. Those were the principles of what he would describe as the good life. If you look around, all the houses are different. The lots are very large lots. People were not forced to live in Leclaire. They could opt to live wherever they wanted to live. Furthermore, there were people who were not working for the company who lived in Leclaire. The underlying principle was that if you believed in the idea of a cooperative community, then live in Leclaire.
Unlike other industrialists of the time, Nelson did not place making money as his highest priority. His goal from the very beginning was to create a prosperous community which would offer ideal conditions to all who lived there. Central to this plan was his belief that individual home ownership was the best type of living arrangement. He therefore set out to make it possible for anyone to purchase their own home. A lot could be bought for as little as $350. A buyer could put $3 as a cash down payment and pay off the loan at a rate of $2 a week. There was no interest on the loans and no taxes for the first 3 years. The Nelson Company had plans for over 1,000 houses, which it could build for a minimum profit. The payment schedule was based on the buyer's income, but most mortgages could be paid off in 10 to 15 years. Every home had water, electric light, and most had bathrooms. The company provided water, fire protection, and electricity at reasonable rates. The residential area of Leclaire was designed and laid out by Julius Pittsman, the architect who designed Forest Park in St. Louis. He stipulated a uniform setback for the houses and put in several curved streets. The homes themselves were relatively small but comfortable frame houses. Even Nelson's home, while larger than most, was plain and lacked the ornate decoration commonly found in Victorian architecture. New residents found that there were many advantages to living in Leclaire. Residents could keep livestock and could grow their own fruit and vegetables, but they still lived close to their work. This gave the advantages of the city with the freedom and economy of country life. Although the first streets were unpaved, Edwardsville was well served by rail transportation, and over 100 electric and passenger trains entered the city every day. Because of these factors, there was a big demand for Leclaire property, and new additions had to be made to the original village. In 1905, over 150 lots were sold in only 2 days. Only 7 buyers failed to pay in full for their property. The company's generous terms meant that no homeowner ever lost his property or lost money by investing in the community. Nelson bragged that there had never been a mortgage foreclosure, delinquent tax sale, or eviction for non-payment of rent. By applying his progressive ideas to his model town, he had created a unique situation. Leclaire had more houses owned by its residents in proportion to its size than any other city in America. One of those early homeowners who still lives in the same house is Walter Abendroff, a carpenter who moved there with his family during those early years.
Yeah, I moved up here in 1920. I come over here in 1919, and I worked for Nelson's up here. I know Nelson was up in business here.
Okay.
And well, I was over here a couple of months, and I got tired going back and forth to Highland all the time, every weekend.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then while I was working up here, I passed this house every morning and every night. And that house took my eye. So I bought the place.
Okay,
And I've been here ever since. And I'm going to stay here till they put me someplace else.
Nelson believed that the central feature of rational life was a person's work, and he placed a great importance on the environment in which workers performed their jobs. His new factory at Leclaire was therefore designed to provide excellent working conditions for the employees. The single-story brick buildings had skylights and large arched windows which provided plenty of sunlight and fresh air. They all contained electric lighting and a sprinkler system in case of fire. Ivy covered many of the buildings, and flower beds were located throughout the area. Each building housed a separate manufacturing section. The complex included a cabinet shop, a brass foundry, a marble yard, and a machine shop. The chief products of the company were pipe threading machines, bathtubs, marble and onyx sinks, toilet seats, fireplace mantels, plumber's brasswork, and cabinets. Near the factory was the cooperative store. Memberships could be purchased for $50 a share. Goods were sold at the average market price, but members received a dividend of 6% a year on their investment and an additional dividend proportional to their trade with the store. Workers were paid the regular union scales for their labor, but since they received dividends from their stock and had lower living expenses, they were much better off than the average workman of that time. While every employee was expected to do his or her job, there was no need for a boss to constantly prod them on. Since they were all profit sharers in the company and had an interest in its success, they were motivated to carry out their work with a minimum of supervision. Considering these factors, the Leclaire workmen found their employment to be as ideal as Nelson had hoped. One of the first Nelson employees to move to Leclaire was William Shaw, who managed the pipe threading division for 52 years.
My parents were living in St. Louis. I was a baby. And the reason that my father came out from St. Louis was because N.O. Nelson found him to be such a dependable, a sturdy, reliable man, young man, and he wanted him to take charge of the factory and help in other ways. And we had a very cute little cottage that was across from the kindergarten at the back on Hale Avenue, and that's where we were. And all the activities in Leclaire took place at the schoolhouse. We younger children all went there to the school until we were ready to go into the third grade. Then we would go down to Edwardsville.
N.O. Nelson was a strong advocate of free education for everyone. One of the first buildings constructed in Leclaire was the Academy, which contained a library and 4 classrooms divided by sliding walls. The educational program originally offered a kindergarten, grade school, job training, and adult classes. Life for children in the cities was often harsh, unhealthy, and miserable. They were often forced to work in the home, spending long hours helping to earn extra income. Their playgrounds were the alleyways and the streets of the tenements. In Leclaire, however, the child's life was totally different. Away from the crime and grime of the urban scene, they were free to develop their talents and enjoy the special pleasures of childhood.
Mr. Nelson was a very, very fond of children. And any time that there was a baby born in Leclaire, believe me, Mr. Nelson would have to get there and see this baby. He was a wonderful man for children and for just humanitarian love and for everyone to live harmoniously and all. It was a wonderful place. It was N.O. Nelson's greatest desire to have everything right for the children to grow up in this wonderful atmosphere and really know, what life can be like. It was a village of love. Well, we didn't recite the golden rule, but we just understood, and that's the way we liked it, and that's the way we did it. We did not have any trouble with our neighbors. It was a wonderful place for children to grow up.
Well, my parents brought me here from Collinville where I was born. I was 2 months old at the time. And Dad and Mom built a home on Holyoke next to my Uncle John, who was already living there. And this is basically the neighborhood we grew up in, which was a couple blocks from N.O. Nelson plant, which we became very familiar with. Being kids, we were into everything.
In between the residential area and the industrial plant was a 2.5-acre campus with baseball and football fields, a tennis court, and a building which contained a billiard room and bowling alley. Nelson loved sports and often umpired and played in community softball games. The academy was also used extensively for social events. The sliding walls could be opened to provide a location for lectures, dances, concerts, and theatrical productions. Nelson invited a variety of social thinkers to speak at Leclaire, including Jane Addams and Edward Everett Hale. By 1913, Leclaire had grown to a population of about 700. There were 167 houses in the village, and 140 of them were occupied by their owners. In 1911, N.O. Nelson boasted that Leclaire was 21 years old and had never had a policeman, a boss, or a divorce. The multitude of children born in the community suggested that the environment was good for raising kids. The Nelson Company was doing extremely well and expanded its operations into several other cities. The future of Leclaire was looking up, but there were events happening that ultimately would affect the entire community. N.O. Nelson had taken on a new project, one that pioneered another form of profit sharing. In 1912, he started a food distribution network in New Orleans. With its own farm and dairy operation, the association could produce as well as distribute its food without paying a middleman. Gradually, this endeavor took up more of Nelson's energy, and he began spending most of his time in New Orleans. The N.O. Nelson Company officers began to question the further use of funds for the project, which they saw only as a losing proposition. Eventually, Nelson was forced to sell his interest in the company, and he left the organization with bitterness and disappointment.
He was the first, I would say offhand, he was the first profit sharer in the United States. He gave away his stock to his employees. When the company was dissolved, they had one terrible time getting back 1 and 2 and 3 shares of stock that the employees had wandered away. In 1918, grandfather had gone far afield and was always doing something, and he bought all these stores down, grocery stores down in New Orleans, and was selling everything at cost. Well, he was breaking himself and breaking the company because he was constantly asking for money to run these stores down in New Orleans. I don't know, I guess they finally had to, he was trying his level best to break the company because so when my father went in 1918 as head of the company, they sort of bought grandfather out. I mean, he had to set up money for his daughter and his wife, but he was a socialist.
Those are the days of the sweatshops and and the working conditions of many, many people in this country were pretty bad. And his was certainly an example to be followed if anybody wanted to follow it, but I don't think very many people did.
Management of the company was turned over to Nelson's son-in-law, Louis Lonan. He had married Julia Nelson, youngest of the Nelson children. Lonan continued to increase profits for the business, but many of the ideals set by its founder had been lost. The N.O. Nelson Company began specializing and eventually became one of the biggest plumbing supply wholesalers in the United States. Unfortunately, in the 1950s, it was forced into a hostile takeover, and its assets were drained by another company. The thriving enterprise was broken down into 95 different wholesale businesses. The community of Leclaire, however, had long ago found out how to live without its founder or the parent company. In 1934, it was annexed to the city of Edwardsville and lost its independent status. Although the cooperative aspects of the village were lost, the roots put down by those early residents have flourished. Despite the changes, the area has retained its unique characteristics. Many homes have changed considerably over the years, but some still look pretty much the same. Since 1990 is the centennial year of the community's founding, there's been a reawakening of interest in its past history. To commemorate the event, school children have paraded through the village, displaying the principles on which it was founded. A maypole dance was also held at the Leclaire schoolhouse, because this was an annual spring event when the kindergarten was in operation.
It's fun to learn what people did back then and how they did it. History is important so you can compare what it's like now and what it was like then and what has improved.
Well, it's kind of important to know about the place where you live.
100 years ago was really the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and things are changing very quickly today, and we are in the computer age, and I think it's very important for not only the children but myself to realize where it all started and how we all begun this process of everlasting change.
And I think it's the cliche that we have to know who we were before we can begin to know who we are.
Well, to know your family is to know where you came from and your background, but it also gives you a lot of insight into the history of the whole world as you go back and back and back. And it's interesting to know that your family had something to do with it.
I am one of those individuals who very strongly feels that in this day and age that there has to be some element of continuity. Our children have to have a sense of belonging and realizing that things just didn't start at the day they became aware of things. You know, we sometimes fall all over ourselves being so intrigued about political figures and what have you who may have come from Edwardsville, or any other community, when we actually had an experiment here, both a social experiment and an economic experiment, that was really quite unique.
In retrospect, we can look back on Leclaire's history and make several observations about its success. The community obviously did not work out quite the way that Nelson had envisioned. In later years, he realized that it would not achieve his earlier utopian ideals. There were some residents who rejected Nelson's values of simplicity and plain living. His failure to create his ideal caused him bitter disappointment and disillusionment. Despite these few dissatisfied people, there were certainly many residents who found Leclaire to be the perfect place to raise their families and establish a home. The generations of children who grew up here are testimony to the strength of Nelson's plan. In this regard, we can safely say that Nelson was successful. He achieved his goal of creating a prosperous community, one that still offers families today a place to settle down and enjoy the pleasures of life. Perhaps the most fitting tribute that can be made about Leclaire is a poem written by former schoolteacher Mildred Shaw Briggs.
The village from whence I came is called Leclaire by name. A real fairyland it seemed to be, with winding streets and many a tree. One man's dream of a perfect village, people said. Well, 'tis true. Each man's home was his castle. Mother was queen with a child or two. We had a lake, we had a school, we had a store, we had church services too. Carefree children played in the sun. Oh, it was all such fun. We have all grown up since that fair day, and many have moved far away. But it's all still there, that beautiful, wonderful, dear little village we call Leclaire.